Listening to Coffee with Kenobi, you are. With Dan Z, the podcast you're looking for. This is... yes.
All of our readings indicate that it's bigger than an asteroid. But at least the atmosphere is breathable.
Well, this is getting more unusual by the minute. I can't even lock down where in the galaxy we are, or if we are even in our own galaxy.
Excuse me, who are you taking us to?
The Father, of course.
Of course.
And what exactly are you?
We are the ones who guard the power. We are the middle, the beginning, and the end.
Is it true that he is the chosen one?
What do you know of such things?
What is about to happen shall occur, whether you like it or not.
You are Sith.
Sith. Yes. And no.
What is this place?
Unlike any other, a conduit through which the entire force of the universe flows.
Are we in danger?
This planet is both an amplifier and a magnet. 3 are here who seek Skywalker. They, like me, believe him to be the chosen one.
My children and I can manipulate the Force like no other. Therefore, it was necessary to withdraw from the temporal world and live here as anchorites.
As a sanctuary?
And a prison.
This is Ashley Eckstein, Ahsoka Tano from Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Coffee with Kenobi. This is your weekly place for Star Wars community and conversation. I'm your host, Dan Zayer, delighted to talk Star Wars with every single one of you. Since May of 2013, whether you are a fan of Star Wars films, Disney Plus live action and animation, books, comics, collectibles, or Star Wars opportunities and experiences at the Disney theme parks, on Coffee with Kenobi, you are among friends as we virtually share a cup of coffee while talking about this galaxy far, far away. Thank you to the official travel partner of Coffee with Kenobi, MEI and Mouse Fan Travel. Check out coffeewithkenobi.com/mousefantravel for a no-cost, no-obligation quote, and let them know Coffee with Kenobi and Dan Zayer sent you. On today's show, we finally, for the first time on Coffee with Kenobi, break down the Mortis Trilogy, starting with the first episode, Overlords. I am joined by Dennis Keithley and Father Jimmy Morgan as we break down this incredibly important and fascinating entry in the Star Wars mythos. So pull up a chair, grab your favorite coffee mug, and let's have some coffee with Kenobi. Joining us today for a cup of coffee. Wait. Before I introduce this incredible group of guest hosts that are going to join me, I want to tell you, we are going to talk about the Mortis Trilogy. The Mortis Trilogy came out...
Yeah, well, Clone Wars is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year, and this was from season 3, so it would have been
January 28th, 2011.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. So we're going to talk about Overlords. It is the first episode in the Mortis Trilogy, this is episode 15 of season 3. It is a 3-part series that is pretty groundbreaking for a lot of reasons, and we're going to talk about it. We've never talked about it on Coffee with Kenobi, and I cannot wait to break it down with these two. So let's bring in first, you know him from podcast, I almost said Starship Sabers and Scoundrels, from podcast Stardust, returning guest and great friend, Dennis Keithley. Dennis, welcome back, bud.
Dan, it's good to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me back. And yes, notorious probably for Starship Sabers and Scoundrels at this point, but it's really good to be here. I've never talked about this episode on a podcast, so I'm excited to do so as well.
Great. I have not either. This is Clone Wars. We didn't really start picking up until the series that came out on Netflix, which was season 6, and then of course season 7. So we've never really gone through most of these. So there's a lot of richness there. Speaking of a lot of richness and wisdom and awesomeness, we have another guest. This is his first time on a podcast, I believe, and definitely his first time on Coffee with Kenobi. I actually met Father Jimmy Morgan face to face at Star Wars Celebration Europe in April of was it March or April?
It was April
of 2023. But you and I became fast friends and started chatting because you are a longtime listener of the show. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome Father Jimmy Morgan to Coffee with Kenobi. My friend, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Very excited to do this deep dive into the first episode of the Mortis arc. I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's going to be fabulous. Let's before we jump into that, Father Jimmy, share with us, because people on this show and just who are on the internet know Dennis's history with Star Wars. What is your history with Star Wars as you drink from a Chewbacca corksicle mug?
I guess I was first introduced to Star Wars early 90s. I was given for Christmas the remastered box set on VHS before the special editions came out. And I just kind of grew into it. My cousins were into Star Wars. I know lots of people might claim this, but then I think I was about the perfect age for episode 1. I was 11 years old. It was the first movie I saw on opening day. And then on top of that, I developed some really good friendships through Star Wars, and that really allowed this love of Star Wars to grow deeper than just movies I passively watch. I have 2 very close friends. Also, a Dan. You're not my first Star Wars friend named Dan. Sorry.
I'll have to find a way to make peace with that.
Yeah. So Dan and Josh and I became friends because we wore Star Wars shirts every day in homeroom, and the rest, it just kind of grew from there.
See, and that's great. I mean, that's what this love of this galaxy far, far away is, and it brings so many people together, starts a lot of friendships, and I love that. Well, we're going to talk about this episode, which does not feature a lot of friendships as far as what's going on the planet, but there is a lot of basis there for what it means to identify. Who do you identify with? How do you protect your friends? There's a lot that goes into it. This, again, is Overlords. It is the first of a 3-part. Mortis is legendary. I never tackled this. In fact, I've never seen this episode again, gentlemen. I haven't seen it since it first aired until I prepped it for the show. I'm one of these people that if something is really, really, really rich, I watch it or I read it and I just kind of drink it in and I just let time pass, because then when I revisit it, it feels fresh. And this felt absolutely mind-blowing. Usually when we review an episode, I guess this is a review, we give one word to describe the episode and overall thoughts on it. So who would like to start? I can, if that helps you both kind of think about this. So my word I'm going to say for this is enigmatic. This is extremely puzzling episode. It's fabulous. It's very, very rich. It's dense. It has so many more questions and answers, and I feel like that is sometimes thrown around a lot. I think it's fair to say, and this is with my English teacher hat as opposed to my Star Wars fan hat, a lot of Star Wars isn't quite as deep and profound as we sometimes attribute it to be. I mean, and I don't mean that as a negative. I mean, just as an intellectually honest concept. Sometimes it's just wonderfully fun. This happens to be both. This is rich. It's full of moments that are really philosophical, spiritual, and enigmatic in nature. And I cannot wait to talk about it. I can't wait to watch again, honestly. Dennis, what about you? One word and overall thoughts on the episode.
I should have known you were going to ask for one word, and I didn't prepare one, and you took the best one, I think, enigmatic. I'm going to go with complicated, and I think my reason for picking that word is because that's my relationship with this episode. When I first saw this, I had very young children, and Clone Wars was their gateway into Star Wars. And this is not one that they were really following because there weren't lightsaber battles. There weren't Jedi versus Separatists, Jedi versus battle droids and the things like that. And we watched the Clone Wars a lot when it was on. We'd record them and watch them over and over again. So this is one we skipped quite a bit. And honestly, when you're watching these with kids and you can get distracted by it, I didn't pay it as mind. I found it confusing at the time and the other 2 episodes in this. And it wasn't until Rebels was making references to this at the end of season 4
Mhm.
that I went back and watched it again and started to develop more of a relationship and a better understanding with these episodes and these stories. And given what we got to see at the end of Ahsoka and how that set so many wheels in motions, I've become very fascinated with this story and its implications for Star Wars at large. And upon closer examination, some of the very obvious themes and things that are happening in this episode that I just wasn't crediting it with before. But those are things that'll come up, I'm sure, over the course of our discussion. So I'll leave it there for now.
Well, that is a great perspective, because this is one I had not shown this one to Mason, because he of course is not the same age as your boys, but he I think it would have confused him. May have been a little scary. Quite honestly, this is often ranked as one of the more scary episodes of Star Wars and Star Wars animation, and I can see why, certainly with the son. But Father Jimmy, what about you? One word and overall thoughts on the episode?
I'd say my one word is mythical, especially the three figures come across very much like Greek mythology to me. It's very full of deep symbolism. We have going over the prophecy of the One. I think it becomes very mythical in its understanding. It's not just the straightforward linear narrative, but there's a lot of myth behind it.
Agreed. Well, the opening sequence, there's in Clone Wars, of course, there's always like a saying that is shared, and I've always found it interesting, like, who is the voice? I mean, do we call it a fortune cookie? Do we call it a pearl of wisdom? Do we call it an aphorism? Whatever it's called. Who was the one telling us this? Is it George Lucas? Because he did work on this. He was very instrumental in the creation of this. Is it someone in the episode itself? Who is it? Is it an unreliable or is it a reliable narrator? It seems like we can always trust it. The one here is balance is found in the one who faces his guilt. Now, it just so happens we have an expert on the show that understands a lot about this. Father Jimmy, I mean, of course, you've got a great background in this as being a man of faith and a priest. When you read this, tell me what this means to you and how can we relate it to this episode?
I think when I first read it, it made me eager for the rest of the episode to see where they were going to take it. And it's one of the things in Star Wars that I think can cause you to keep going back to, keep thinking more and more on. But as you mentioned, someone who may be an expert in guilt, so to speak,
well,
it is our past, especially our past mistakes, aren't what define us. It is something that doesn't just go away out of nowhere, but it's not what defines us. And so there's a struggle sometimes to overcome the guilt, to get rid of the guilt and move on, to move forwards. And I think a lot of that comes into play in this episode and in this whole arc as a whole.
Excellent. Outstanding. Dennis, what do you think?
Yeah, I think he knows better than me. And I think that was a very good description. I've meditated quite a bit over the years on past mistakes and putting them behind myself. Now, I'm not necessarily looking for balance on the force, so to speak, but there is something that I think with age and a certain amount of wisdom develops, that there's things that happened 15, 10, 5 years ago even that you can no longer have control over, and dwelling on them isn't going to change your life anymore. And so if you're looking for a substitute piece for balance, and I think those can be synonyms sometimes, that confronting that guilt is, and overcoming it is key in that regard.
I love that too, but excellent. I knew you two would be perfect for this. I while you were talking, I thought about this. I think the opening statement that is given for us, that balance is found in the one who faces his guilt. To me, again, English teacher hat, that's the thesis, right? That is and when I tell my students, look, a thesis statement is somewhere in the opening of your paper. It doesn't have to, but historically, typically it is. And everything in your paper, I should be able to read everything in your paper and it should point back to that main idea, that thesis statement. Everything in this episode points back to this because this is a very Anakin-centric episode. he is the one selected and elected by the Father, because we've got the Father, we've got the daughter, and we've got the Son. We've got a Trinity. We've got a triangle here. And Anakin, they want Anakin here because they think he is the one to replace the Father and help balance out. But Anakin, of course, has this incredible albatross on him, which is his guilt. His guilt for what we learn in this is the slaughter of the Tuscans. And I think for me personally, it's good for me to see that he does feel guilty about it. I think it's very, very clear in Attack of the Clones that he feels terrible about it. You know, and then when he confesses it to Padme, so to speak, he's angry, and he kind of brings up the rage again. And then I think that makes him feel at the same time angry about what happened and why he did it, but also bad at the same time. It's like this perpetual cycle. And Father Jimmy, that can be really, really hard to get out of your own way with that kind of thing.
Yes, that's true. Sometimes when we have these moments of guilt in our past, it's much easier to replay it, to keep thinking, what if? Maybe if I had done this better. Anakin's probably thinking, if I had been more attuned to the Force, I could have shown up sooner and saved my mother, and then wouldn't have needed to slaughter all of these sand people. And so this cycle of what ifs can be very restricting. It can almost, in a sense, create a interior prison for someone if they don't find the way to really come to terms with what they've done in their past and how to move forward.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I love that. So the interesting thing here is, first we see the daughter, okay, and the daughter is supposed to represent the light side of the Force, and we're going to only focus on this episode. Okay. First, I think it's pretty neat that in this episode, I think this was pointed out on CWK Live this week, but throughout the history of Star Wars, whenever we see a Force wielder levitating or using telekinesis to float rocks, there's something mystical about it. Well, the whole planet is full of floating rocks. Pretty interesting little subtle thing there, I think, has a lot of power behind it. But what she tells them when she shows up is really, really interesting. She talks to them about, she asks right away to Anakin, are you the one? And only he can hear it at first. They cannot, which I think is interesting because we're told this planet is a massive conduit for the Force itself. What do we think about this woman being the representation of the light side of the Force? Dennis?
Well, good question. I think one of the strengths of this episode is that we kind of get these archetypes here. And if you look at them, you've got the daughter. She is capable of turning into a griffin. When later, to kind of jump ahead a little bit, when we meet the son, he's all dark and he turns into a gargoyle. And so we've got the griffin you see traditionally on things like heraldic shields and that type of work there. And it's supposed to be a representation of nobility and strength and honor and things like that, which are ideas that we regularly associate with the light side of the Force. She's got a friendly demeanor. She is very soft in looking, and I'm not saying weak, I'm saying soft in the way she's portrayed with curves, and she is not harsh on the senses, again, compared to the son later. And so I think they did a fantastic job in giving us an idea of who she's supposed to be pretty quickly in that episode.
Right. We're told this planet is a massive intersection for the Force, unlike anything Obi-Wan Kenobi has ever seen. She explains to him, we are the middle, the beginning, and the end. I think it's interesting. I need to think about this a little bit more. Maybe I'll use this for grad school. But I like the fact that the daughter, who is the light side of the Force, is female. And the son, who is the dark side of the Force, which he soon poo-poos the idea of him being Sith. He is, but he isn't. Which I think is a pretty cool thing that we learn through the Bendu and other aspects of Star Wars, that, just because you're a Jedi doesn't mean you have the monopoly on the Force. As just like with the Sith don't monopolize or own the dark side, even though they think that they do. There's much more to it than that. It's really, really complicated. And obviously, Father, I don't have to tell you that Trinities are a pretty important deal. I mean, of course it is. Of course it is. But I think it's fascinating. And the notion of threes has been a really, really rich, powerful archetype throughout the history of mythology, particularly in British lore and the Celtic countries and things like that. But it's always been a really, really important thing. So this triangle is this idea of balance, the beginning and the middle and the end. I don't think of the beginning, middle, and the end as balance, but what do you guys think about that? We haven't even gotten the episode yet, and there's so many things just around this notion.
Yeah, I think it's with them being the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's an interesting concept because it almost puts the Force outside of our linear experience of time. If the beginning, middle, and the end all exist in this one place. And it also kind of relates, again, jumping ahead to a line towards the end of the episode. I believe it was Obi-Wan who says the planet is the Force. Like so there's this, now granted, he's in the midst of it. Who knows exactly how in tune he is to be able to explain that the planet literally is the Force. But if it is the Force, then it would obviously have the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Force all contained within it.
Right. And in that same vein, I think if, let's say the Death Star, for example, blew this planet up, would the Force be gone? I don't think so. I think there are some planets that are particularly strong with the Force. And speaking of strong, when the sun shows up, he is also fascinated by the idea of Anakin being the chosen one. They both ignite their lightsabers to try to attack him. And in one of my favorite scenes, he just kind of goes like this, almost annoyed, dismissively, and he makes their lightsabers retract and go back into their hilts themselves. He laughs about being a Sith or not being a Sith. And then there's this continual thing throughout the episode, guys, about nature. And we even see half the planet is like dying and the other half is light and healthy. But they also point out there are no animals. To me, and this is just a crazy, ridiculous thing I just thought of, maybe this planet is supposed to be a living manifestation of Anakin's inner turmoil and psyche. Maybe it is. Maybe that's kind of the great concept there. Because when he sits in front of the Father, there's a fabulous discussion. I really think it's interesting. I really think it's important. And when he goes up to the Father, for no particular reason, when he approaches him, he instantly sits in front of him cross-legged, like the Father is his master. And without even being requested to do so. Tell me what you both think about the Father. Dennis, we'll start with you.
Well, you just said a whole bunch of stuff that I'd love to react to, but I'll try and control myself there and limit it to the Father. Okay. So one of the other things, by way of answering your question, that the daughter says is that they're the guardians of the power, I believe, and they don't even call it the Force yet at that point in there. And when Anakin gets to the Father, this planet has gone through a day and nighttime cycle. And when day breaks, everything comes alive. And then as night falls, everything dies. So we have creation and destruction. And so those are mirroring the two sides of the Force. And this has all happened by the time Anakin gets to the Father. And so I don't think Anakin is contemplating this the way that Obi-Wan is giving thoughtful contemplation to everything that's going on, because Anakin is much more a headstrong type of a guy. And so he's wandering up to the Father, and it is kind of alarming that he does that. He just kind of sits down at the Father's feet when later he's got his lightsaber in his face. Yeah. And that's what you typically expect out of Anakin. I don't understand what's going on. Reunite me with my friends. Who are you? How do I get out of here? That is the way he tends to operate there. But he does seem to understand that there is more to this place, and it's obvious, than meets the eye. As Qui-Gon tells Obi-Wan later, it's a conduit for the Force. And we know it's dangerous for him to be here, but they all feel the power of this place. And so perhaps that, as much as anything, is what gets Anakin to stop, take a moment, and sit down in front of this person who is in the middle of quiet contemplation, who's not threatening in any manner, hasn't even said anything to him. Are you the one? It's just, is there.
Well, it's also pretty cool. We in a very short span, we see Ahsoka and Obi-Wan, and I can't remember how many times the three of them have been just together, just the three of them only on a mission in Clone Wars. But I can't imagine it's very, very often. It's just the three of them. But when the sun appears, Ahsoka and Obi-Wan get in defensive positions. Anakin puts the lightsaber blade right in front of the son, or in front of the father's eye. I mean, that's pretty violent. That's extraordinarily aggressive. And of course, it's not a threat to the father at all. His primary focus, his only focus, his myopic focus is, I need you to discover who you are. I need you to be centered. A great look. We should all be centered. We should all be able to be calm. What is it in Hamlet? Hamlet compliments Horatio, says, you are one who, in suffering, one is who suffers nothing. You are very balanced and perfectly at peace with yourself. This is what he wants from Anakin. Anakin is not currently capable, at least we don't think he's capable of doing that. But Father, what do you make of the father? I've always wanted to say that.
First I thought it was interesting, before he even meets the father, he calls this space a monastery, which always invokes this sense of, regardless of which religion the monastery is from, this sense of solitude, sort of escaping from the world for that, finding balance, finding that inner sense of calm and peace. And I was really struck by, as well, the fact that Anakin shows such kind of reverence towards the father, such docility towards the father, when there's this common notion or theme understanding that part of the downfall of Anakin eventually is that he loses his father figure in Qui-Gon, and Obi-Wan isn't quite there to fill that role. Obi-Wan even says, "You were my brother. I loved you, Anakin." And yet Anakin shows the most reverence towards the father. And so I think there is this search for a father figure, and he recognizes it in the father. But then when he gets rattled by this vision of his mother that's given through the son, and this is again a little confusing with all of the names, he gets kind of rattled, and that's when that aggression comes out at him, and he lashes out at the father.
Right. Again, not able to maintain that balance. It's just a great psychological thing. The Force is so complicated, and one of the reasons it's complicated is because it's not real. But another reason it's complicated is because it evolves and changes over time. Dennis, you mentioned earlier there are other things that you wanted to react to, but so feel free.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not even sure where to begin on that. But, it's the planet itself. One of the things that was great about rewatching this was we've got now the lens of Rebels, and we've got the lens of Ahsoka to watch it through. And I don't know about y'all, but seeing the end of Ahsoka and watching Balin standing on a statue that looks like the father, and then having this glinting object off in the distance that now looks very much like this monastery, and then having seen at the end of Rebels that there were representations of the father, son, and daughter that led them into a portal that got into the world between worlds, which also featured in Ahsoka. And so you sit up straight when you hear Obi-Wan say things like, when they get to this planet, is like, I'm not even sure what planet we're on, or even if we're in our own galaxy, which is a line that would have washed over me every time I watched this episode prior to today. Didn't even remember anything like that was said. And so, yeah, when you were talking about the planet, it's like, well, is this a planet? Are they on Peridia, like they were at the end of Ahsoka, or because they flew into a monolith? And a lot of these, they're things that, as you both said, we have questions, we don't have answers here. And so it was both intriguing and a bit infuriating, if I'm being honest.
Please,
when I sat down with this, but to me, again, with the planet and the day and night cycle, it was just something that was fascinating. I think the first couple times I watched this episode, but it just jumped out so much of that we are looking at the balance of the Force, and you're going back to that fortune cookie that was at the beginning of the episode here.
Mm.
And, the father is imploring Anakin to take this test, prove he's a chosen one, because it's important to the balance of the Force. And when you got that continuous cycle of night and day, that I think just screams balance right there.
It does. And I think it's pretty cool too, because if I extend that metaphor of the planet as a sort of a physical representation of Anakin's metaphorical journey, spiritual journey, nighttime is always be careful. When it's nighttime, you got to get out. You've got to get shelter. I think nighttime is Vader, really. And that's obviously very, very true. Father Jimmy, did you want to react to anything with that, or would you like to move on?
Just a quick thought when you mentioned the reaction to the planet. One of the things I noticed in this rewatch, again with the planet, again Obi-Wan saying the planet is the Force. When night comes and things are starting to get destroyed and then rebuilt, I noticed quite a few of the trees, even though their sort of physical body is gone, there's this light version of them, and I immediately thought of Yoda's explanation of the Force when he says luminous beings are we, and there's always this sense, no matter what's destroyed of these trees, there's this luminous aspect of them that remains, which I just found a really interesting and cool
it
part
is
of this.
It's fast. Luminous beings, are we not this crude matter? That's awesome. So when that leads perfectly into this, what you both said, because Qui-Gon Jinn does show up, and I am of the opinion that Qui-Gon is very, very easy for Obi-Wan to see in this moment. For one thing, I won't talk about the next episode. I don't want to break my own rule, so I'll pretend like I never said that. What Qui-Gon says to Obi-Wan is unlike any other, a conduit through which the entire force of the universe flows. And the Force is, as we know, the Force is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. This planet is both an amplifier and it is a magnet. It is not the Force. Qui-Gon is clearly telling Obi-Wan, I know what you thought before, but no, this is an amplifier. It's a magnet. It's a conduit for the Force. So everything here is super, super strong, which is why, of course, they want him there, because Anakin's powers can be completely at their absolute, I just got a flower and I'm Super Mario peak and I can shoot fireballs, right? All we need is a little graphic of his power level when he's in that battle at the ending, which is pretty funny.
This is Vanessa Marshall, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
Before we continue the show, I want to tell you really quickly and remind you about the amazing things going on with Lumen Fire. Their brilliant solutions are, in fact, brilliant and extraordinarily helpful for your business. Lumen Fire builds brilliant custom apps and websites that make businesses more effective, productive, and profitable. All great things, I think we could agree. This includes automating business processes and integrating software systems so they talk to each other, which is always very helpful and makes things much more efficient. They are experts in FileMaker, Laravel, WordPress, Apple, and other technologies. Please check out their site at lumenfire.com. That's LUMINFIRE.com. Lumenfire.com. But what would either of you like to say about Qui-Gon Jinn's appearance in this, and anything jump out that he says to Obi-Wan?
Well, I underlined that quote in my notes that you just shared, Dan, about this, because I felt like it was so incredibly important, and I like the explanation you gave for it, because this is an opportunity for, if Anakin's the chosen one, then we don't have to tease it out of him here. This is a place that it could definitely happen. And again, and the other thing is that he does call it a planet, and a lot of, again, those references are something that I think when you're watching this episode the first time without having the lens of things that come after it, then you don't make as much of a deal of, now that we know that this is a physical place, possibly a physical place that you can go to. But I also thought it was interesting that, this also seem to impact Qui-Gon's ability to show up to Obi-Wan, because this may not have been, available elsewhere. He shows up to Obi-Wan at the end of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, and he tells Obi-Wan, "You just weren't ready for this yet." And Obi-Wan flat out asks him, "How is it you're here? You're dead." And Qui-Gon goes on about how special the place this is, and the conduit language there. So there are a lot of things that can happen here, and we can call it whatever we want. I've been just calling it Mortis straight up because just as a shortcut for having to say this planet or wherever they are. But but I really liked his appearance in this, and it was such a welcome surprise, and great to hear Liam Neeson back in Star Wars when that happened.
Definitely.
I wasn't. I mean, I was moved by his words, but I was more struck by just the appearance of Qui-Gon, and sort of how we have these three different visions or visitations or dreams, depending on what the character is, where, Shmi shows up to Anakin and Qui-Gon shows up to Obi-Wan, and I think future Ahsoka shows up to Ahsoka. And just the interesting aspects of, when we're talking about this guilt, talking about kind of coming to terms with your guilt, I'm sure Obi-Wan had some guilt on seeing his master die in front of him, on that experience. So for me, that was a part of it. It was the healing presence of Qui-Gon showing back up for Obi-Wan. To me, it was almost more important than the actual words that were said.
I muted my mic. Yes, I think that's fair. There are three major things I want to talk about before we close things out. One, when Shmi shows up, voiced by Pernilla August, the very brief conversation that Ahsoka has with her future self, with very long Leiku, and then the big sequence with the balance contest itself. So we'll just take it in order. Father Jimmy, you brought up Ahsoka talking with her future self. What jumps out about that conversation? It was pretty brief, but I think there's some meat there.
I think for me, again, this took a deeper sense of it now that we've seen Ahsoka, the series, and we've seen what she's struggling with in the future. Kind of these words of future Ahsoka really rang true. But I was also struck by the fact that she's visited by herself in the future. It seems she's most preoccupied with who she's becoming and not who she was. And it seemed to me that the future Ahsoka looked in this very idealized form, with a very long Leiku, the very kind of shapely figure. She seems very idealistic. And I think maybe being trained by someone who is considered to be the one probably puts a lot of pressure on Ahsoka for who she is going to become.
I agree with a lot of that right there. Mm-hmm. I think the reference to the series Ahsoka and what she's going through there is spot on, because at this point in her life, she's a teenager. She admires Anakin. She looks up to him and has been super appreciative of everything that he's ever done for her. He's always stood by her. And now she's being told by her future self that this guy that has taught you everything that means so much to you is planted the seeds of the dark side in you. And you've got to get away from him. You got to get away from here. And how could that not be disturbing when you get a dangerous warning about someone that you so respect, love, and admire like that?
So, absolutely. So there's a couple of things that she says to Ahsoka. She says, there's a wildness to you, young one, seeds of the dark side planted by your master. If they are in fact planted, then that to me would indicate deliberate manipulation or mistrust. At least the way it's worded there, or maybe just planted not accidentally, but inconsequentially. I can't even say the word. Just by her being around him and just kind of being exposed to him. But she says, like, you will never see your future if you remain his student, because he's impetuous and so are you. Is that, I think that's true. I think that's fair. That's why you want to surround yourself. You hope that your children are surrounded by good role models. We hope that we are good role models for family, friends, parishioners. But I think it also implies, well, it's just really complicated. What I wanted to say initially was, if that's true, if she's that easily manipulated, then she's not super strong-willed, or she doesn't have a strong sense about her. But I don't think that's fair. I think it's a fair sage warning, but I also think it's a bit of an underestimation of Ahsoka, because if this is the big thing that Ahsoka is struggling with, that we are very much expected to understand and comprehend in the Ahsoka live action series, which doesn't really exist in a narrative as presented, this gives a context. But I don't think you should have to watch an episode from 2011 to give a full season context. Besides a few things here and there, and again, I haven't rewatched all of Clone Wars in a very long time. But if this is her big struggle, that she's afraid she'll end up like her master, which here she has no idea he's going to be Vader because he hasn't been Vader yet. I think it's interesting. But I also think this vision, is it from the light side or is it from the dark side? I think it's supposed to be from the daughter, right?
Okay. I would say actually the son. And
that would make sense, yeah.
Because it happens at night, and that is the sun's domain. And Qui-Gon has also told us that this planet, it is a conduit and it's an amplifier as much as it is a magnet. And so the sun, he shows up a bit later and tries to, we'll talk, it's one of the things you would talk about in a second, is that, he tries to poison Anakin's mind about Padme. And so he's amplifying maybe something that's in the back of Ahsoka's mind, something that's coming out of her subconscious, because she was asleep when this all started. And then she wakes up to this vision. And so for me, it seems like this is an application of something that the dark side is doing when, maybe even at Zenith, when the planet's not in balance.
Yeah, I also was uncertain of how trustworthy this vision is for Ahsoka, like where it's coming from, because Anakin's vision, we get a very clear indication that that's coming from the sun, that's generated from the sun. And then Obi-Wan's interaction with Qui-Gon, I took to be legitimately Qui-Gon and not some manifestation of the planet. So I wasn't actually quite sure where Ahsoka's vision was coming from. Is it from the Force itself? Is it just from something inside of her being amplified by the planet, or was it the sun intervening? That's one of these questions that I had from the episode that I personally didn't come to a clear answer on.
You're on mute.
I've never podcasted before. You have to forgive me. I think it's got to be the sun, because, but it's not terrible advice. I mean, when you watch again, she's just saying be wary. But the sun, I mean, evil wants to separate, right? Evil wants to take you, remove you from your where you're grounded, your spirituality, your connection with love. And of course, the Force is such a weird contradiction in so many ways, because you're encouraged to love, but you're not supposed to be in love. And it's kind of a whole weird thing, a combination of a lot of concepts and ideas. But the fact that it is at night, I would think it's the sun. But it also makes sense it'll be the daughter, because if the son goes to Anakin, and then everybody sees something, right? So if you see it once from the father, once from the son, once from the daughter. So the daughter talking to Ahsoka might make sense because of what happens later. I don't know. I think it's pretty cool. When the son talks to Anakin as Shmi, her main method of persuasion is, look, she is a poisoner. She says that Padme, she says, I love her more than anything. Anakin says that. And she says, but your wife is a poisoner. Why is she a poisoner?
Well, if Father Jimmy doesn't want to say it, I'll get there. It's really difficult to talk about somebody and their spouse and say that their spouse is a poisoner in any type of relationship here. The best explanation I could come up with this is that the son through Shmi is foreshadowing what Anakin is going to confront and why he's going to make these terrible decisions that he does. And I can't remember exactly what he says, but it's if you can't overcome your guilt, it's going to be, the ruin of you. And, Anakin sacrifices everything for Padme and her safety, as we see in Revenge of the Sith. And, we know that because that movie came out before the Clone Wars did and what happened here. And I don't think it's fair necessarily to call her the poisoner because this is a decision that he made. But again, is the poison to blame if you take it and you do something with it, I suppose. And he willingly indulges in this and therefore, ends up committing so many atrocities later. I know that's not real artful, but
no, but I think you're right on because we don't have a lot that we go by. Here's what is said. So when she said, "It's time you realize that your guilt does not define you, my son. You define your guilt." Okay, that's not bad advice. That's not. And then he says, "The only love I feel in my heart is," and I'm watching the captions, "is haunted by what would happen should I let go." And then she says, "Then it is not love; it is a prison." And that's when Anakin says, "But I have a wife. You've met her. She's everything to me." And then she says, "She's not your destiny." And he says, "But I love her." And she says, "No, she is a poisoner." So in this moment, even though I don't think that everyone is a part of this has the idea that one of the great ways the Emperor will manipulate Anakin and turn him to the Sith is by using his wife. I don't think that's the idea here. I think the son taking on the persona of Shmi is saying, "Look, I don't want you to feel guilty, because it's the devil has power to seduce and assume a pleasing shape." I'm quoting Hamlet again. But so she's going to get his trust, and then you can't keep your love about your wife because then maybe you'll want to leave the planet, right? I don't want you to worry about love and compassion and empathy for someone else. You need to kind of be selfish in a way, even though she's telling him not to be. That's actually the opposite. He says, "What are you?" And she says, "I am your fate." And the son turns into this massive gargoyle, this really kind of anime-looking weird gargoyle Pokemon thing. And it's pretty cool. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting idea of how he is being manipulated and how you're being told one thing that's actually kind of true, but then you make it so that it's actually not true and make it a lot worse than it actually is. It's almost like a demonic possession thing. It's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
Yeah, no, I think you said that well there, Dan. I think it's he is of the dark side. He is doing some subtle manipulation. One of the things that the father says in this episode is that of both of his children, that if there's not some sort of balance between them, and I'm paraphrasing here, if it's just one or the other, if they're left to their own devices, they'll tear the galaxy apart. It'll be the unwinding of the galaxy. And he's not specifically just talking about the son. He's talking about the daughter either here. And neither one of them seem to get that, the daughter or the son. And the son seems to be maneuvering for some sort of a control, because after this scene, Anakin comes up and says to the father, what was going on there? And he says, "Oh, that was probably my son's doing. You seem to have met him."
Interesting. Father, there's a lot of crazy stuff here with the son. What kind of stands out to you about this conversation?
Again, the subtle manipulations and the subtle driving where the son kind of comes in with this sense of the love and the tenderness of the mother and really trying to get Anakin to give over his guilt. But it's this slow build up to this tipping point of Anakin really getting close to cracking and going and killing the father to take the place. We don't know if he'll take the place at that moment, but like we said, he puts the lightsaber millimeters from the father's face right afterwards. And I think the son touches on that kind of exposed nerve that Anakin's leading this split life because of his love for Padme. And so while it's not really a poison, I don't think Padme is really a poisoner for Anakin at all. The son is using this to say, all your hardships right now are coming because you love this woman that you're not supposed to. And this brings the anger out of Anakin that he just can't control. So he goes and puts that lightsaber back into the father's face to kind of get to the bottom of everything.
Right. We could easily spend the entire episode just on this conversation. But we honestly could. But I want to talk about the end. The way that balance, the father gives Anakin a test. Look, you can save Obi-Wan, or you can save Ahsoka, but you can't save both. I feel like this happens to Spider-Man all the time. And I'm trying to remember who holds Ahsoka and who holds Obi-Wan. Do you remember? Does anybody remember?
Yes, the daughter holds Ahsoka and the son holds Obi-Wan.
Okay, that seems pretty apt. Well, instead of me breaking it down and saying what I think, I'd love to hear what the both of you think about this test and sort of what happens as a result. I think there's a ton of symbolism in this too, I think. Go ahead, Father Jimmy.
Yeah, one of the first things that stood out was, the pleading of the two on the either side. I think Ahsoka is saying, don't give in, don't listen to him. And Obi-Wan's first thing he says is, save Ahsoka. Obi-Wan gives this sacrificial side to things that Anakin doesn't pick up on. And I mean, this is kind of some of my own interest in the psyche of Anakin and everything, is that the self-sacrificial love doesn't come into his options for any of these decisions until Return of the Jedi. And so he doesn't think about sacrificing himself to save the ones he loves. He thinks about just becoming more powerful and controlling the situation instead of, again, giving of himself.
Wow. Dennis?
Well, a couple observations. One of the things that's always bugged me about this scene the most is that the daughter, who's supposed to be a representation of the light side of the Force, is there ready to rip apart Ahsoka, apparently, on the father's command. If everything the father said was true, that Anakin can't save them both, and if he chose Obi-Wan, then was she going to go through with that? So there's that. But the other thing that stood out to me this time was when Anakin makes his decision on what he's going to do. It's in the middle of the day, and suddenly this big starfield shows up. And I think it's important that it was a starfield and not nighttime in this regard, which was very much more of a neutral ground, and it's supposed to reflect this balance. Because this, right after this, the father says, "You've passed the test. You are the chosen one," and it's because he managed to bring both the daughter and the son to heel, and he makes them kneel in front of them. He screams at them to kneel at the time that happens. And again, on first glance, I thought, that's just a cool effect that we had this whole starfield that, Anakin drew on so much on the Force, but I think it really was supposed to be that this was a neutral path. This is him bringing both sides to bear at the same time.
Fascinating. So I'm looking at the symbolism because we've got the daughter who is the Griffin. That is the creature that she transforms into, and then the son is a gargoyle. So Griffins, I've been looking at some things about Griffins, and Father Jimmy, have you heard anything about Griffins in all of your studies?
Not directly in my studies, but knowing we were going to talk about this, I started to dig into it a bit more. And so Griffins have this symbolism, again, as Dennis said early on, of this regal side to them, like the sign of virtue. But I think also they encompass heaven and earth, where you have an eagle and a lion together. You have the heavenly domain of the skies and the earth. And so in Christian symbolism and early Christian art, it's sometimes an image of Christ as the two, the human and the divine. And so I found that interesting with the griffin imagery in itself.
Yes, there's a Hispano-Roman scholar known as Isidore of Seville. He was interested in this. We probably looked at similar things, and I know this from studying mythology as well. The lion and the eagle are both very, very majestic, very, very regal. And over time, they were considered either the symbol of the papacy or as opposed to the symbol of Christ. But, the fact of being human and divine, we're not saying that this griffin is Christ, because that's ridiculous. But it is kind of cool to see that these things are very majestic and considered beautiful. Plus the green, I like the fact that the light side, the daughter, is green, and then the son, who's the dark side, is black and red. Green has got when we see the light side on this planet, on Mortis, it's always green and beautiful and kind of very earthy and natural, and there's kind of a spiritual aesthetic to it. Plus she glows as the griffin. Either way, he is able to use the Force. He amplifies the Force because Obi-Wan tells him, this whole planet amplifies the Force. Use it, brother. So he holds out his hands and he does it. And I'm not going to say he makes it easy, but I won't say it's the hardest thing that Anakin's ever had to do. Not only does he make them release his friends, because he decides, I'm going to save everybody, but he makes them transform into their human selves and to kneel. And to the Father, that's all that he needs to see. You are the one who can create balance. You are the one who can tame the light and the dark. Now we know Anakin can't do that. But it's almost, in a way, it's almost unfair, because had Anakin not been constantly bombarded with the evil machinations of Palpatine, is the closest thing to the devil we have in Star Wars, would it have happened? I don't know. That's probably a conversation for another time. But either way, I remember when I first saw this ending sequence felt like a video game, and I thought it was a little bit cheesy. But now that I'm watching it, and now that I'm thinking about it through a mythological lens and just sort of through time, I think it's fabulous and truly, truly fascinating, because it also amplifies the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, because in this manifestation of this balance of self and anger versus good and what that actually means, he proves that he can do it. He's more than capable of doing it. And the fact that he doesn't is just another example why he's just this terrific, tragic hero.
Well said. I agree with you completely there. I'm with you, Dan. The first time I saw this, is like, I don't get what we're doing here with this episode. Why, what we're doing with these creatures and what this has to do with Anakin's journey. But and this is one of the reasons why I was looking forward to this conversation. When you sent me the invite the other day saying, hey, we're going to talk about this first episode, I was like, fantastic, because this is the type of crowd I need to get through this discussion here. And I really like that. I think it's, and I guess it's also fascinating that, you got the father sitting behind, just kind of observing all of this and being neutral about it. He puts the test in front of Anakin, and Anakin could have easily turned around and taken everything out on him as a way of solving this, but he didn't. Instead, he went after the son and the daughter.
It's very interesting in this little trinity that the father is the one who is neutral, and the father is also the one that's the most powerful. So I guess de facto, that means that neutral is the most powerful. Is that what we're supposed to think? Or are we supposed to say neutral makes you powerful because you're balancing good and bad? Because he doesn't appear to be evil, and while it appears that he doesn't appear to be good, I'm more inclined to think that he is good, because he wants there to be balance, because he says, without me, since I am dying, middle is dying, which to me shows that the dark side is starting to slowly take over the galaxy, which we know that it is because of Palpatine and the Sith. So he wants it to be balanced, and he says, you're the only one who can control my children. So it's not only about controlling the dark side, but it's also about controlling the light side. And I think that I talked about this a lot, and I had the good fortune to write about it in the Star Wars book. The balance of the Force is a lot of things. It could mean, does it mean you're completely eradicate evil and there's only good? But then that's sort of not really balanced. Or does it mean that evil exists so light can rise and overcome it, and take care of it that way? That's kind of a lot to digest when we're at the very, very end of the episode. What do you think as we wrap up, gentlemen? Want to weigh in on that before we give our final letter grades?
Yeah, I think this whole notion of balance of the Force is one that I think it is one of my favorite aspects of it, because it continues to generate these conversations. It's not something that's cut and dry that we can just easily point to and say, oh yeah, here's what balance means. We can keep having these conversations and pull in other parts of movies and books and comics. And but in this in particular, it does seem to imply that there is this balance between the two. And it's interesting to judge whether or not how neutral we think the father is. He does put this test forward that if Anakin doesn't pass, it's going to lead to the death of at least one, if not all of them.
It doesn't sound neutral.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've always thought is that maybe it's not appropriate to think of the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force as necessarily the good side of the Force versus the evil side of the Force, as it opposed, if you look at like The Last Jedi, when Rey is meditating with Luke outside the cavern and she's sensing all those things that are going on Octo, and there's those visions of the porgs and the eggs hatching, and then that's the light side. And then the dark side is crushed eggs that have been destroyed by other forces of nature. And so it is this creation, destruction, night and day, a cycle of thing. And maybe the light side versus the dark side isn't one long straight line continuum as much as it is a circle, and things continually rotate around the circle, kind of a yin and a yang, which is why earlier in this episode, when we see the day and night cycle with everything coming to life and then dying and then coming back to life, is so appealing. Is that the night and the light and the dark side are circulating, and they're maintaining that balance because they both both wax and wane over through time. And to think of a more medical explanation why you couldn't have just light side, you couldn't get really the dark side, is that if light is creation and it's left unchecked, well, the only thing that grows unchecked is a cancer cell, right? And so if you get rid of the death and the destruction of the dark side, then that's what you're left with, and that's how you could end up ripping the galaxy apart, if that makes any sense.
Wow. So you've been hitting home runs, but you just hit a grand slam. You saved your best for last. That was really cool.
Well, thank you.
That was cool. All right. So should we jump into our final thoughts and letter grades? Father Jimmy, what would you grade this episode? And any final thoughts on it?
For a letter grade, I think I might have to go with A-. I like this very much. I think there's a lot to it. But it in the grand scheme of the Clone Wars, seemed to come out of nowhere. So I have trouble grading it just on its own. One, because it's part of this 3-episode arc, which is part of this larger whole. And I think I would have liked a little bit more prep from what was coming before it, before diving into this pretty symbolic, in-depth episode that can go a lot of different directions. But I like it. It does one of my favorite things in Star Wars, to develop the sort of mythology and lore of the Force.
Yes. All right. I didn't know what you're going to say, so well done. Dennis.
Well, I think in the last couple of days and through this discussion, my grade for this episode is skyrocketed, because this had never been one of my favorites until this week. And now I'm going to give it, I think I'm also going to go with an A- on this one. And I think Father Jimmy hit something there. It's not necessarily what I come to Star Wars for, in which, the adventure and the good versus evil, rebellion versus the Empire and that type of a thing. But for what this episode is, it is absolutely fantastic. This conversation we had and getting to dive on the details has just been so much fun. So I'm going to go ahead and go with the A-.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, I'm giving this an A+. This is my favorite kind of Star Wars, when I don't know what's happening and I may never find out. I love I remember in a philosophy class, getting my undergraduate, I remember the professor saying, there are two kinds of people that like questions and people that like answers. And I remember thinking, without a doubt, well, I like questions. And I like knowing, but I'm comfortable not knowing. I like the idea of allowing this concept to sort of breathe and marinate and talk about it with two intelligent individuals like yourselves who love this stuff and appreciate the history and the mythology of what Star Wars is and what it has to offer. I think it's so smart and so psychological, and it's completely character driven. The best kind of stories are absolutely, that's okay. I kind of like, it was like a sound effect that you used for us. The best kind of stories are the ones that focus on character, because you don't care about the characters. And if there's not a little bit of depth or interest to them, then for me, I'm not going to waste my time. And that is why I think this is a terrific episode.
Listening to Coffee with Kenobi, you are, with Dan Z, the podcast you're looking for. This is...
Well, thank you, sir. Father Jimmy, I think you passed that audition, my friend, with flying colors. You did a terrific job. I hope you had a good time. We certainly had a good time chatting with you and learning not only from you, but from the amazing Dennis Keithley as well. Father Jimmy, thank you again for being on. And where can people, if they want to ask you any questions, where can they reach out to you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dan. This was a great experience. Dennis, it was great to chat. I loved it. I do this all the time, just not record it. But if people do want to reach out, I'm not very active on too much social media, just the platform formerly known as Twitter. And you can find me at FRJimmy_Morgan.
Very, very good. And Dennis, where can people find you? And please let us know what's going on with your podcast.
Right. So podcast Stardust is that's my Star Wars podcast that I host with Jay Krebs. We put out 3 episodes a week talking about news. If you want more Clone Wars discussion, we just started a series on Hondo Anaka. And
sweet.
Yeah, so that's been fun. And all of our social media contacts there, X, Facebook, Instagram, or at Podcast Stardust. As for myself, I'm most active on Instagram right now, and that's at DJ Keithley. And I like to talk about grilling. I like to talk about running and my dogs, which you all just heard from a second ago. So, yeah, that's where you can find me. But it was so much fun to be on this episode. It was a pleasure meeting you, Father Jimmy. And thanks for having me, Dan.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.
There's no one here. Move along. Move along.